My name is Danita Welch. I'm the manager for local government program services at the Union of BC Municipalities. We administer a number of funding programs on behalf of the province of BC, including the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund. So we have our agenda up today. It's our hope that we're going to have a fairly brief presentation, and then we'll move on to Q&A, which generally has a fair amount of questions and value for the participants. Just in terms of introductions, Rebecca Bishop is one of our program officers for the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund, and she will be taking over the majority of slides after I've completed the intro here. And then I'll come back on at the end to support the moderation of the Q&A. I also wanted to acknowledge that we have our other program officers from UBCM here, as well as colleagues from the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. And they will certainly pop up as needed as questions arise in the Q&A session. I did want to take a minute to excuse me, acknowledge that I'm fortunate to be, and I believe actually all of our panelists have the good fortune today to be coming to you from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking people, represented today by the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. A couple of housekeeping pieces for the webinar today. If you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function. So you'll see that button at the bottom. The chat is on, but it'll only allow us to send messages to attendees. Attendees will not be able to put any information into the chat. So right now you'll see we posted the links to all of the program guides in the chat if anybody's interested and hasn't yet had a chance to look at those materials. But certainly for questions, enter them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to get through all of them today. We also are recording the webinar and we'll post it on our YouTube channel after and provide that link if others want to have a look. And then just in the case of anybody who does want to ask a question and the Q&A function is not working for you, please click the raise hand button and our administrator will be able to see who's raised their hand, and we can unmute your microphone at that point in time when we get to Q&A, and you can ask a question that way if the Q&A function is not working for you. So on the screen, you can see our agenda. We've covered off our welcomes, our introductions. Rebecca's going to walk us through a handful of slides now, and then I'll be back for the Q&A. Rebecca, over to you.
Thanks, Danita. So just a little bit of background on CEPF. The program was launched just over 6 years ago now, and funding continues to be provided by the province, the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. And from a operational perspective, UBCM is the administrator of the program, but we work very closely with Emergency Management BC, the First Nations Emergency Services Society, and the Office of the Fire Commissioner. They contribute technical knowledge and insights to really support the evaluation process, the development of materials, etc. So at present, CEPF includes disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation, and that fund very much replaced the flood risk assessment, flood mapping, flood mitigation planning, and the structural flood mitigation funding streams to provide a more global lens in terms of risk, but also to really focus on climate readiness. The two next ones have been existing from the get-go: emergency support services and emergency operations centers. Public notification has undergone a slight change in terms of the name, public notification and evacuation route planning. The two last streams are relatively new: volunteer and composite fire departments, equipment and training, and Indigenous cultural safety and cultural humility training. So I'm predominantly going to focus on the three streams that have intakes coming up this fall, which includes disaster risk reduction, volunteer and composite fire departments, and Indigenous cultural safety and cultural humility training. So I'm going to start with DRRCA. It has three categories that you can apply to each of in one application intake if you so choose, or you can just zero in on a particular category. It's up to you. Depends what you need, what you're looking to do. So category 1 is risk mapping, risk assessments, and mitigation planning. Up to $150,000. You can do more than one project within this category if you so choose, or you can devote all the funding to one project. And a lot of you will be familiar with the fact we had an extreme heat and extreme temperature intakes. Those have now been collected into category 1 of DRRCA. So they continue to be eligible funding activities in this funding stream now. So the second intake stream is non-structural activities, land use planning, which are activities that contribute to the long-term disaster risk reduction, climate adaptation lens of making amendments to relevant plans, bylaws, and policies. You are able to develop policies and practices for the design and maintenance of First Nations land and publicly owned land, such as parks and open spaces, and for the design and maintenance of First Nations owned buildings and publicly owned buildings from a disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation lens. You're also allowed to purchase monitoring equipment now, such as hydrometric stations. This monitoring is really intended to support the DRRCA funding stream. So if you are wanting to monitor potential flooding and going to do flood mapping, etc., that would be the rationale for getting reporting and equipment to monitor and obtain the kind of data that you're going to need to support those activities. There's the delivery of community education and awareness projects, for example, community workshops, story maps, and public art projects. And something to note, K-12 curricula is not going to be an eligible training activity. It's really intended for community level education to the public. Also very exciting a change is we've really provided a comprehensive list of temporary mitigation equipment that will support communities. They have to demonstrate that the community has the capacity and plan in place for the maintenance and repair of the equipment, as well as its deployment and removal. But this means we are going to be funding the types of sandbags that are not provided by EMCR, other flood barrier assets such as tiger dams and gabion baskets, portable air conditioners and air scrubbers for use in First Nations owned building and local government owned buildings, for example, for a cooling center are eligible. Misting and water bottle refill stations to keep your community streets a little cooler, and storage for temporary mitigation equipment, which is limited to shipping containers and trailers. I am reading directly from the guide, so everything is available in the program guide to provide you with all the details and information you want to need. I'm just going pretty high level. Another exciting development is that now Category 3 small scale structural projects is providing up to $5 million per application. This is not a stream that's going to allow you to do regional projects to stack $5 million multiple times. That would blow the budget entirely for the whole funding program. So it's one applicant per $5 million. You could do regional, but the cap remains $5 million for small scale structural. So I'm not going to go over those kind of eligible activities. It's in the program guide. I'm going to move us forward, but the Q&A will come up so you can ask specific questions about that. So the next funding intake with a deadline of October 20th, volunteer and composite fire departments, equipment and training. It remains $30,000 per applicant. You are able to do regional projects so that you can stack funding depending on the number of eligible applicants. And it remains unique in that eligible applicants include First Nations, local governments, electoral areas, and society-run fire departments. So society-run fire departments, they have to demonstrate that they are in good standing. And they also have to demonstrate, you all need to demonstrate that you're a true fire department. So you do have to demonstrate what your level of service is for this funding stream. If you're interior or your exterior, etc., it affects what you're eligible to purchase through the training and equipment. Pardon me, purchase through equipment and the kind of training that you want to attend. We're continuing to support phase 1 of the structural protection program that works hand in hand with the structural protection coordination office. And again, that's not just equipment, there's also training that is required through that program. So phase 1 is eligible here. Further phases are eligible through the CRI program. Also new in the program guide is we've got a pretty detailed list of what training is going to be available. And again, also pretty clear equipment lists on what's eligible. Something that's new to all of our program guides is that there's a definitions section to help very specifically delineate some of the language and terms that we use. For example, composite versus volunteer versus career fire departments are something that's clearly defined there. I'm going to move us on to the third stream. Indigenous cultural safety and cultural humility training. This will be, I believe it's third intake, deadline November 3rd. It's up to $30,000 again per applicant. First Nations and local governments are welcome to apply, and regional projects again are eligible. The target audience for this training are emergency professionals who, pardon me, emergency professionals who are going to engage with First Nations, enter onto Indigenous territories for the purpose of emergency response, and folks making decisions regarding and affecting Indigenous communities. So elected officials might be appropriate folks to participate depending on what they're doing in terms of decision making. EOC staff, ESS staff and volunteers, fire, police, ambulance. This is your audience. It's not for the general public, but for those staff and professionals who are going to be working with supporting Indigenous communities. And your options are you can hire someone to deliver training, or you're able to actually develop training materials and conduct training. So again, there's great detail about the intended learning outcomes from training in the program guide. So you're going to want to read that thoroughly to get a real firm grasp on what's intended for this funding stream. So upcoming in January, February, March, and April, ESS is returning, Emergency Operations Centers, equipment and training, another intake of DRRCA, and public notification and evacuation route planning. We've had this question before. If you applied for DRRCA in the spring, you can apply in September, and you can apply again in March. So each intake, you're permitted one application. So that means you can actually pursue a lot of funding, and we've designed it so that they're following roughly every 6 months, so that your programs can projects can segue on from one to the next as efficiently as we can make possible. So very briefly, I just want to touch on the fact that we're working towards a tool that will allow you to do some of the initial sign up for your application online, who you are, what stream you're applying for, your contact information, and you will still be filling out application forms, but we're trying to make them as lean as possible to make your lives easier. But the old-fashioned basic application form process will always remain an option, but we're trying to modernize. So that was pretty quick, and I'm going to bring Danita back, and hopefully there's lots of questions in the Q&A for us to get started with answering your questions.
Thanks, Rebecca. We do have some questions. So I did already answer a couple of them. So just for folks, I know some folks can't always see the chat, or sorry, can't always see if we respond to things in the Q&A. We will publish the answers that we answered by typing after, but one of them was in relation to what type of, how we would prioritize projects under DRRCA, and speaking to having risk analysis completed before a structural project takes place. My response was from our program guide, which speaks to the fact that foundational evidence is required for all Category 3 projects. That generally includes risk reduction or adaptation strategy, preliminary planning and design, cost estimates, and benefit cost analysis. So the expectation is that depending on the project, because there's variations of what evidence would look like depending on what type of mitigation strategy is being put forward. But we certainly do have a requirement that foundational evidence is in place for the adjudication of projects under Category 3. And then there was a question about stacking, which I also answered. So the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund does not have any stacking rules, but other funding programs might. So what we always advise is that folks should be checking both programs or the multiple programs that they're intending to apply under to ensure or to confirm if any of the programs have stacking rules. Not as common necessarily under provincially funded grants, possibly more common under federally funded grants, but it's always worth the applicant checking all funding sources before they start. So I'm going to go back to the questions live now, and I'm going to start by calling on our colleagues from EMCR with a question around monitoring equipment, and does that include seismic equipment? So either Heather or Brittany wanted to pop on and help me out with that one.
I can answer that one. It does include seismic monitoring equipment. I believe it would include it, yes, for critical infrastructure and fire halls. Yes.
Great, thank you. And then we have a question around, when you say stack volunteer and composite fire departments equipment and training, does that mean you can apply early for a few years? Rebecca, can you maybe clarify what you meant there? I'm not quite sure what the question means.
Can you read that again? I can't.
You could just open the Q&A there, but it's around, I didn't hear you say anything about stacking volunteer and composite fire department equipment and training. So, I mean, the short answer is no, you cannot apply for multiple years. The funding is for 1 year. So the project would be approved from, basically the day you receive the approval agreement for 1 year following.
Right, so it's not the same as CRI is maybe perhaps what they're thinking. It's one application at a time, and you've got a 1 year window to complete the work.
Okay. So Indigenous Cultural Safety Grant, is it only those who are interacting with Indigenous communities based on emergency services? I'm assuming that means is it only, is the training only eligible? I mean, generally speaking, the purpose of the training, the purpose of the grant is to help entities that are providing emergency management services to Indigenous communities receive that type of training. I mean, I think one could make the argument that that type of training is probably helpful for working in any type of cross-cultural situation. But certainly the specific intent of this program is to, better support, especially local governments in providing emergency services to, with Indigenous communities. Heather, did you want to add to that?
I would like to, yeah. I think it's important to note that it would be intended for support with Indigenous individuals as well. So not necessarily just Indigenous communities, but an organization that is providing emergency support services where they're going to be interacting with people, with Indigenous people, even on an individual basis. I would recommend that they consider this kind of training to help support them to better provide those services.
Our next question is also in regards to cultural training. Are there any recommended instructors / companies that either you or the audience can recommend? So UBCM is not able to recommend consultants or contractors under our funding programs. That's a potential for conflict of interest there, so it's not something we are able to do. I'm not sure, Heather, are you aware of any resources that sort of list out these types of contractors or consultants specific to Indigenous cultural safety?
Yeah, none that I'm aware of. However, you could get in touch with us to see if if we can dig something up, like a reference or a list of some kind, and we could look into that outside of this meeting, but not offhand.
Would you be able to share, Heather, the generic EMCR email address
Yeah,
in the chat so folks would know how to contact you?
absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Okay, so another monitoring question. Does this include seismic monitoring equipment? Oh, specific to critical infrastructure and fire halls. I mean, I would say generally speaking, the equipment needs to be in relation to disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation. And if, I'm assuming the question means to locate it in relation to critical infrastructure and fire halls. Probably not problematic. But the most important piece is that the equipment itself is to achieve the goals or the intent of the DRRCA funding stream. These are for all of BC. So I'm assuming the question is, are all of these funding streams available to all of BC? Yes. So all local governments, so all municipalities and regional districts, and all First Nations, including bands and treaty First Nations, are eligible applicants across the province. Okay, can someone apply to DRRCA and also apply to another funding program within CPF since they cater to different objectives? Yes, so you're able to apply. Eligible applicants are able to submit one application per intake in each of the funding streams. So you can apply for volunteer fire departments and DRRCA. You can apply for EOC and Indigenous cultural safety training, or any combination that makes the most sense for your community. Where are direct links to the programs? So participants should be able to see the chat, but you won't be able to type into the chat. So the links were posted right at the beginning. There's 3 links for the DRCA, the Volunteer Fire Department, and the Indigenous Cultural Safety Training. There was a link from UBCM LGPS to everyone at 1:28. Those were posted. And then generally speaking, if you're looking for program materials for this funding stream, ubcm.ca/CEPF is the short version getting to our website for the overall Community Emergency Preparedness Fund. Okay, we have the next question. Under the Equipment and Training Fund, Fire Department Equipment and Training, it was mentioned that our level of service plays into what we are eligible for. How much impact is there if we are declared to be exterior level based on our training equipment, but are working towards interior? Does it preclude us from applying for equipment around interior operations if our declared level of service is only interior? Yes. So if your current declared level of service is exterior, then the expectation would be that you'd be applying for training and equipment that is required for or appropriate for exterior attack only. Working towards interior operations probably is not strong enough in terms of the requirements for the application with the Office of the Fire Commissioner to be, you wouldn't be considered interior yet. So we do have a requirement in that funding stream that communities provide evidence of their level of service. So quite often for local government run fire departments, that's via a bylaw or a resolution from council. So whatever level of service for a local government, and this is a local government question, whatever the local government has declared the level of service to be, that would be your limitation in applying for funding under that stream. A question around community kitchens. Small scale structural question mark. We need to enlarge our kitchen for storage in our community kitchen, walk-in cooler, walk-in freezer, but structure would have to be enlarged. I mean, we would need a lot more context from that description. I'm not clear how that would be a disaster risk reduction climate adaptation project. We certainly have looked at proposals in the first two intakes that are looking kind of more towards broader community preparedness to lessen the impacts when disasters do strike. You'll see that in our current program guide, we do put some parameters around that type of community preparedness, that it needs to be at the community level and not the household level. So this is an anonymous question, but I would very much encourage whoever added that question to follow up with either UBCM or the email address that's been posted for EMCR with a bit more context so we could understand that, that question in a bit more detail. Okay, moving on. Can I partner with a regional district and First Nation and each of us apply for 30,000 and stack for equipment purchase with a total of 90 for one fire department that provides protection services for the 3 communities? Yep, so you can submit a regional application in that case. And so there would be one primary applicant. The regional district and the First Nation would be sub-applicants. It's important to note that when sub-applicants are joining on another application, that is their only application for the intake. They also don't get to submit their own application as a primary applicant. So that is one thing to keep in mind with regional applications. But if all 3 entities want to come together in a single application, that is an option, provided that the resolutions are submitted from everyone and that we can demonstrate that there's a regional benefit or regional impact to a region within a regional project. Certainly for the volunteer fire department, volunteer and composite fire department, as an example, live burn training facilities, which tend to be more regional in nature, are something that we have seen come through in these types of regional applications. Can our emergency services program partner with a local nonprofit? Can our emergency services program partner with a local nonprofit for delivery of educational programming under category 2? Most likely, communities, local governments, First Nations, ultimately make the decision about what third parties they involve, whether that's consultants, contractors, local agencies, etc., for the delivery of funded activities. Again, we just want to know a bit more details about what the educational programming would be to ensure that it's meeting a disaster risk reduction climate adaptation lens. But the actual partnership and how the delivery works in an individual community is generally something that doesn't impact eligibility. What does CEPF stand for? So we live in a land of acronyms, and we should really do a better job not speaking in acronyms all the time. So apologies. That is the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund. So that is the overall umbrella initiative that has all of these multiple funding streams underneath. And yeah, so apologies for the use of acronyms. We should know better by now. Next question. I'm going to maybe call on my colleagues from EMCR to answer this, but the question is, are new CEPF funding streams anticipated with the introduction of the Emergency and Disaster Management Act? I can say from UBCM's perspective, we certainly don't have agreements to do any expanded funding, but maybe I'll let the province speak to that question at large.
Yeah, I'm not involved in the Act revisions, but I can say that as those are developed and we have a better understanding of what that looks like, we'll have a better understanding of the funding needs of communities in order to respond to that. So I understand that this is a bit of a non-answer, but nothing is planned right now, and it would depend on what the Act what the act looks like in the end. I know that historically there have been times when we have had funding programs to help support communities to meet their legislative commitments, and so that it's a possibility, but we haven't decided yet, or we won't know until we know what the legislation looks like.
And the expectation is that that legislation right now, the forecasted timeline is spring sitting at the legislature. So spring 2024, is that still?
I actually can't
Okay.
do exactly the timing because I can't recall what the most recent announcement has been on this, but it is going to be a little while. I can say that we have had lots of conversations about funding and the upcoming changes to the legislation and the need to support communities to meet their requirements. So it is an active conversation right now.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah. And don't go away because I can see a question 2 down. We'll come back to you. So we have a question around emergency operations centers. So we didn't necessarily cover that funding in this webinar because those intakes are not happening until winter of 2024, but let's review the question anyways. For those interested in the mobile EOC, Emergency Operations Center, if any funds are left over from the purchase of a trailer, can it be used to supplement in equipment for outfitting the trailer for mobile operations? Any funds were left over. So in all of our grant applications, we need to know all of the expenditures you're going to make. You know, you don't kind of have the ability to have leftover funds and then apply it to what you would like in the community. So all approved projects have an approved budget. And generally speaking, if you come in under budget, then the grant is reduced. So I don't know, Rebecca, I don't know if you'd add anything to that, but based on the way the question's phrased, I would say no.
I would say that they could submit an amendment request to assign now freed up funds for eligible equipment under the EOC program, because I'm assuming they're meaning equipment that would go in the trailer, and maybe that would be a desk and a laptop, or, you know, radio systems that would go into the trailer. We've definitely done that.
So, I mean, it would be a maybe, I guess. The overall process for amendments, generally speaking, you can't ask for something new, something that was never considered under the original application as an amendment, because you're not amending an activity, you're adding a new activity. But if it's within the general spirit of what was approved, there's certainly some opportunity, at least for the discussion with the program officer, to determine if that would be something that we could allow. Okay, rolling along. So the question I think is in relation to Indigenous cultural safety training, but let's get through it here. This would be for a new program development and delivery. So not sure how we would demonstrate Indigenous participation for an emerging program. Oh, maybe this is DRRCA. The expectation under DRCA is that applicants are able to demonstrate that they have proactively engaged with neighboring First Nations, Indigenous organizations before the application is submitted, to look for areas where there's, you know, there's opportunities to work together, to opportunities to incorporate Indigenous knowledge, you know, general relationship building, all of those pieces. And so the expectation, again, if this is related to DRCA, and maybe I'll just say if you are entering any questions in the future, if you can maybe reference the specific funding stream that you're asking about, that would maybe make my job a little bit easier. But the expectation is that applicants do proactively, so prior to submitting the application, engage with Indigenous neighbors as part of the process of developing an application, which would ultimately support the ability to identify the role that Indigenous organizations or neighboring First Nations would be playing in the proposed activities.
You missed a question.
I did miss a question. Sorry about that. I will go back up. This one is for you, Heather. Oh, you're on mute.
There we go. Yes, a seismic flood hazard assessment would be eligible on the under category 1 of DRRCA. Yeah.
So it is eligible.
It is eligible. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
We just have to enunciate that one very carefully.
Okay, and you might as well stay here, Heather. What about funding for assessments of terrain stability and landslide risk upslope of Indigenous communities?
Yes, so the land ownership for risk assessments and mapping is a complicated piece. So typically, yes, it depends on who owns the land, but for the purpose of an assessment or mapping or other sort of foundational activities, the ownership of the land is a little bit we could fund a project that has multiple owners. And there's another question down below here that says a risk assessment of a slope hazard area, which is a mixture of private land and city right-of-ways for infrastructure, because the majority of the area is private land. Does that mean it would be ineligible for risk assessment funding? So it's kind of the same question. So the short answer is yes, it is. The implementation of an infrastructure solution, though, gets a little bit more complicated, because we always want to fund the organization that owns the infrastructure and will take responsibility for it over the long run. So yes, for the risk assessment, mapping, etc. But when it comes to the actual infrastructure itself, we want to make sure that the person we're giving, or the organization we're giving the funding to, is the one who's responsible for the infrastructure, so that we don't create orphan infrastructure or put a community in a position where they have a piece of infrastructure that's not being managed appropriately.
Maybe if I can just ask a clarifying question, Heather.
Yes.
So when we speak of owners, to the first question about the upslope terrain stability, we're talking about for the purpose of planning, whether that upslope portion is on reserve, whether it's provincial crown land, local government land. For that form of planning, we're less concerned about the ownership and then we would be at the implementation stage. But to the latter question, which speaks to private land, we would not fund planning activities for private land. Sorry,
It looks to me
that was meant to be a question, not a statement. Would we fund?
Yeah, there we go.
Planning for the private land?
I think in this situation, so this is a risk assessment that they're talking about. So if it's the risk assessment, yes, we would fund it for private land, given that it has an implication for the community in general. So the risk is to the community. We understand that given that we have a range of land ownership around the province, you could have a risk generated from public land, private land, etc. For a plan, it's a little tricky, because we would want to make sure that the landowner is involved. So I think we could fund a plan for a community if that included private and public land, but we would want to know that the private landowner is involved in that and that they are a part of that process. The people we would be funding is the local government or the First Nations, though, in that case. It gets a little tricky, and I understand that this is not the most straightforward answer, so please contact us and we'll talk through it. But the key for us is making sure that we're not funding this group over here for a project that actually this group over here needs to be responsible for. So it gets quite complicated, especially in the planning world, as Danita mentioned. The question here was about a risk assessment. So the risk assessment, yes, again, we would still want the landowner to be involved in the risk assessment as well, to make sure that they're aware that it's happening and able to be involved in solutions. Is that clear, Danita? And is that where with your understanding of the approach we're taking to this?
Yeah.
And I wish we could, hand a hard rule, but I feel like if we try to put a hard rule in place in this particular situation, we run into being overly strict and overly prescriptive when communities actually need us to really think about the context, given just the sort of patchwork of land ownership considerations we need to take into account in the province.
Thank you. So the next question is about air curtain burners, and I'm just turning my head for a second because I'm just looking up some notes in the program guide. So the question is would an air curtain burner to reduce forest fuel loads in the community that cannot dispose of yard waste other than backyard burning be eligible for purchase and paying as a non-structural activity? So I'm assuming you mean as equipment. We do have some eligibility challenges with some type of equipment and with because there is a fulsome wildfire program, which also doesn't fund air curtain burners, but we tend not to fund most projects specifically in relation to wildfire mitigation under CEPF. So my suggestion would be to the person who wrote that question, again, is to send us an email with a bit more information or give us a call so we could talk that one through a little bit more. So a question about improvement districts. So as Rebecca spoke to, under the volunteer and composite fire department funding stream, improvement districts that operate a fire service are eligible to apply, but that is the only funding stream that improvement districts are eligible under for the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund. Heather or Brittany, if I could call you back for the next question.
All right.
The question is, what grants support regionalizing HRVA?
I believe that would fall under DRRCA category 1. Yeah.
So this was the next question was a follow-up to our previous conversation about areas prone to landslide and risk assessments, and Heather's already answered that. So I think we're good on that one.
So the clear answer on that too is just, we have an area that is prone to landslide and is a mixture of land ownership. Would it be eligible for risk assessment funding? Yes. Please include the various landowners in your project so that we can make sure that they're aware of the risks and that you're working together on solutions. Once we move into infrastructure and planning, the conversation shifts slightly. So if you're dealing with a project that has a complex land ownership situation, give us a call and we'll work through it.
Thank you. Oh, the next question isn't a question, it's a thank you. So you're very welcome. Okay, so disaster risk reduction is more for flooding, or is disaster risk reduction more for flooding, or also the heat emergencies, as you mentioned, something about coolers for a cooling station or in a public or banned building. So certainly recognizing that extreme temperatures are part of our changing climate, that is within the scope of DRRCA. We do have eligibility under category 3. And I'm just looking up the exact language. So an eligible activity under category 3 is public cooling or warming infrastructure, which could include natural infrastructure, such as trees, to reduce community vulnerability to extreme temperatures. For example, a designated cooling or warming center, cooling corridors. And then just to note that that would be exclusive of any type of shelter programs that are already operated under the extreme weather response program.
Can I jump in, Danita, and just mention that, yeah, DRRCA, as Rebecca mentioned, has come out of this flooding stream, but it is all hazard with the exception of wildfire because we have a robust and active wildfire program. So DRRCA can be used for flooding, heat emergencies, drought, which I want to highlight, as well as other natural hazards and climate-driven hazards. So it's quite broad, and this can mean that we come across things that we've never seen before, but it's pretty exciting that we've been able to broaden it out like this, and I just wanted to make sure it's really clear. It's not just a flooding program. We can certainly be wider than that.
Thanks, Heather. Okay, with the volunteer and composite fire department equipment and training program, do we need to finish our 2022 project before applying to the 2023? No, you don't. In a perfect world, everybody would finish up before they apply again, but we recognize that, you know, generally speaking, we give you, well, we do always give 1 year on that funding stream to complete activities, And for most communities that were approved sort of early winter-ish of 2023, they potentially are only 9 or 10 months into their 1 year by time the deadline comes around this fall. So you're not required to be finished in order to apply again for the next funding stream or for the next intake. Okay, a question about curriculum. Does it expressively state that youth education programs in K to 12 are not accepted as public education program? Why is this not accepted? So under the new, the 2023-24 disaster risk reduction, we have identified, and sorry, I'm turning my head again, just so I can find the exact line, that the development of curriculum for kindergarten to grade 12 education is ineligible for funding. The reason for this, there's a couple of reasons. One is that EMCR, formerly under EMBC, Emergency Management BC, are the keepers, the creators of the Master of Disaster program, which is the school age emergency preparedness curricula in BC. So the curriculum in the broader sense of emergency management already exists. The other response I could offer, and I mean, certainly Heather or Brittany jump in if you want to add to this, is that, you know, our team, our reviewers are not subject matter experts when it comes to the intended learning outcomes, which are prescribed by the Ministry of Education. And so we would not be, so we're not able to adjudicate those types of applications. We're not the Ministry of Education. And it's really important that any curricula that gets developed is evidence-based. It's reliant on current, evidence, research, science. And again, we're not always sure if the curricula that was proposed would be, would meet those, both the intended learning outcomes and the evidence-based side. So, I mean, certainly we do provide, I mean, we can provide funding for community level workshops, but if the intent is in-school delivery, which is the intent of the ineligible in our new program guide, then we are not funding K to 12 curricula for the intent of, you know, for the development of the curriculum to do educational components within the school. Probably other community education components, including school age audiences, would be eligible or would be considered, but it's the specific activity of writing curricula that has been identified as ineligible.
So I just want to make sure we're really clear on this. So the development of K through 12 curriculum is ineligible, but you could deliver a workshop or a educational program to K through 12 for, you know, community outreach under the guide based on established criteria. Is that correct, Danita?
Yeah. So I mean, any type of community level education would be eligible. You know, you need to see that clear alignment with the intent of the disaster risk reduction climate adaptation funding stream. And again, it would be focused on community-wide preparedness and not sort of household or individual community preparedness. So yeah, Heather's right. The ineligibility is the development of curricula for K to 12, but broader community education that would be targeted to school age children, again, as long as it aligns with the intent, could be considered.
Yeah. And just as a little more background on the intent, part of the reason that we are doing that this way is that this funding is really about that community level resilience to natural hazards and climate driven hazards. And if we stretch the funding to include things like household level preparedness for emergencies, we just stretch the funding source really thin. There are there are at times ways of funding those types of things, but we are really about the community level work. So we have a few programs that we have funded for education in the past, and if you've got questions about whether or not it would be eligible and how to frame it so that it's about the community level rather than household level, feel free to get in touch with us. And we're happy to talk through it a little bit more. But again, delivery is fine at the K to 12 level or any other community level. It's just the development of the curriculum that is not eligible.
Thanks, Heather. Our next question takes us back to volunteer and composite fire department funding. So our community dock is essential infrastructure for emergency medical evacuations via a dedicated medical response vessel. And it's also important for disaster evacuations from our small island. It is owned by the regional district but needs repair. Can our fire department apply for funding for this or staff with the regional district? So I'm just gonna, again, turn my head here. So we don't do any capital improvements under the fire department funding stream. So that would be one response, is that would be considered, you know, a capital improvements. We also don't fund, generally, we don't fund training or equipment that's more focused on medical assist. The fund is really for response to structural fire and cross training for wildfire. So those two pieces combined would lead me to suggest that the proposed idea would be ineligible. But you know, as with all of these, we can't provide a full answer on specific community circumstances without more information. So certainly feel free to reach out. But yeah, I mean, this is not a capital program and it's not intended for medical assist. So might be a couple challenges there with that concept. Okay, so looks like it's just a clarifying question to the previous question around cooling systems. My question meant to say, is disaster risk reduction is more for flooding or also heat emergencies? As you mentioned something about coolers for cooling stations. So the disaster risk reduction climate adaptation funding stream, as Heather and I were both trying to allude to, but maybe we haven't been clear enough, is all hazards with the potential exception of wildfire. So certainly extreme temperatures and heat emergencies fall within DRRCA. And cooling stations and public, cooling centers would be something that would be eligible under that funding stream. The next question just says Crown land. And then, well, maybe the following, Dawn. Oh, Heather's typing an answer onto the following one. So maybe she's already, I don't know, Heather, maybe just want to pop in and.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask
instead.
I was going to ask for a little bit of clarity on that one. So we don't give, this funding source is only for First Nations and local governments. We do not give money to provincial government agencies or ministries. So the entity we're funding would, I think in this case, be First Nations. One of the challenges here is, of course, that there could be a nation or a local government that is dealing with a hazard that originates on Crown land. We could fund that First Nation or the local government to develop a risk assessment or a plan, as long as the provincial ministry that is responsible, if that's Ministry of Forests or Transportation or whoever, is involved in the development of that. And we know that we're not funding something that would create a conflict or a problem between different agencies. But it's complicated. So my suggestion would be, if you are dealing with any situation where you've got a hazard that is originating from a combination of land ownership or Crown land or private land, that you give us a call and we work through together how and if we can create a project there that's eligible and able to sort of pull all the parties together. because those are really just tricky situations. And I wouldn't want someone to develop an application and go through that whole process and then find out that, you know, it's ineligible or that the partners aren't coming to the table. So I think give us a call and talk through the specific situation is probably the best advice I have in that circumstance. Is that fair, Danita?
Yeah, that's great. And the only
okay.
thing I'd add is, you know, on the flip side, we also don't want people to assume that their project would be ineligible and not apply without talking to us first, just because of some of these land tenure challenges and sort of the location of the risk versus the impact, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, I mean, the short answer is either the CEPF email or the EMCR email is the great starting point. You know, we've got a few months before the deadline's coming up here, and there's certainly 2 deadlines up for DRRCA. So there are opportunities to reach out and discuss your projects so we can understand them better and provide some clear advice.
Yeah. And my apologies that we can't provide something super clear. It's just that the situations tend to be so complicated that if we created a hard and fast rule here, I think that there would be hazards that we would be not dealing with in the province. So it's just better for us to kind of have these conversations. So please call. We want to help develop strong projects.
So our next question is about community halls. So does this include community halls that the regional district does not own, but that have been designated as group lodging site and warming cooling center for the community? So under the, I've got the wrong program guide open. Under the disaster risk reduction climate adaptation funding stream, we do have the requirement that, and this you find this on page 2 under eligible projects. So we do have the requirement that if a project is, you know, generally relocated around a building, in this case, if it's a hall, that it is owned by the First Nation or it's publicly owned by the local government. And then to Heather's point previously, when we get to talk more about infrastructure or assets, you know, if it's more about an asset, that asset needs to be owned by the applicant so that we know that it's sort of, you know, somebody who has responsibility for the asset or the infrastructure is the one proposing to do the mitigation work. Okay, we've got another thank you here. Not quite sure about the next one, so I'm just going to skip it for right now. So Heather, over to you. What is an example of drought support help towards?
Yeah, so this is a little bit like where we were at with extreme heat about a year or 2 ago, where we started opening up our funding sources to include it. And so I would look to communities to tell us what they need funding for related to drought support. So whatever examples I give right now, please don't think that we're limited to those examples, because this is a new hazard that we're funding, and there are probably things we could be doing for drought that I'm not going to be aware of, and we would want you to tell us. So I think an example could be risk mapping, risk assessments, and something like risk and resilience plans. So if a community wanted to develop a plan to deal with drought, they could do that. And if they wanted to do drought mapping, we don't have any standards for that yet, but you could propose something and we can start to work on what the provincial standards for drought mapping could look like. Lots of nature-based solutions for dealing with drought. Yes, Darlene, I think that there could be quite a bit in there that we could see this time around. And I would say, you know, feel free as always to call us and say, what do you think? Is this eligible? I think there's going to be quite a lot when it comes to drought that we are going to have to figure out how to assess and how we make it work, but we want to make sure that we're funding communities for the hazards that are important to them. And given what's happening in the province right now, we certainly think drought is going to be one of those. So the examples I can think of are tend to be on more of the risk assessment, mapping, et cetera. Darlene, I don't know if you've got lots of nature-based solutions for drought, maybe drop them in the chat and we could have a conversation with them. But I think there's quite a lot a community could do with this funding when it comes to drought and extreme heat.
Great. So there was 2, I think, questions here around drought that we've answered. We're just so folks know, we're almost to the end of the list. So if people do still have more questions, we do have about half an hour left in the scheduled time. So if you do have more questions, please feel free to drop them in there. A question about satellite phones. Are any funds cover satellite phones? The cost per minutes is outrageous, or cover apps for communications, handheld radios. So certainly, or Rebecca, why don't you speak to EOC under this for this question?
Mhm. We have allowed for satellite phones and forms of communications that will support communities who might lose communication capacity in the event of like phone lines going down, the internet going down. So we've definitely funded a lot of sat phones. I think that would be eligible in volunteer and composite fire departments as well. Communications are essential there. And we've also funded radio.
We probably want to check that with the OFC, actually. There are some limitations on some of those kind of more ancillary purchases for fire departments.
Mhm. But it's certainly been very common in emergency operations centers. We've done some satellite towers to provide greater reception in really remote areas. So in essence, that's a yes.
Yes, under the emergency operations centers training and equipment funding stream. So
Danita, can I just add as well? Britt just sent me an example. So in our most recent DRCA announcement, we have the Kanaka Bar Indian Band's water surfacing for climate adaptation and drought resiliency project. And this one is a water line and reservoir that will help reduce the impacts of drought for their community, which includes social stress, health stress, ecosystem stress, food system stress, and heightened fire risk. So that's an example of a infrastructure solution or something under the category 3 that could be eligible for drought. One thing I would just add on drought and heat both, that again, this is community level, not household level. Just always keep that in mind in the application so that we don't run the risk that you focus in the wrong area.
So there was a link provided around the drought resources, and we can share that with some of the Q&A that we share out after. And the final question I'm seeing here, unless people start typing in some more questions, as a reminder too, if typing in isn't working for you, certainly you can raise your hand and our administrator will unmute your microphone so you can ask the question. But the last question I hear is about, will this be shared to YouTube? Yes, so this is being recorded. UBCM has a YouTube channel and we will send out the link to that shortly, probably take us a day or two, and then we'll share that. Oh, and I see some of those resources for drought have now shown up in the chat. So for those of you that were interested in additional drought resources, there are there's a link there for an example from Salt Spring Island.
Under volunteer and composite fire departments, there is, for instant command equipment, radios is permitted.
Okay. And then just a comment around droughts and reservoirs, not a question there that I can see. So I'm just going to maybe pause. You've certainly heard a lot from me, and thank goodness for Heather, so it wasn't just me answering questions, and to Rebecca as well. We'll pause maybe for like 20-30 seconds here, see if anybody else wanted to add a question. And if not, we will wrap up with the reminder that we're here to help you be successful with your grant applications. So contact the program officers at UBCM, contact EMCR. If you submit a question directly to us and it's more of a technical question for the ministry, we're happy to broker that exchange, help you introduce you to the right folks. So I'm not seeing any further questions show up. So I think what I'm going to do is offer my very sincere thank yous to everyone who took the time to join us today. I think we were upwards of about just shy of 100 participants for a while there. And then to thank Rebecca and Heather and our other staff. Oh, the question just popped up, which I will answer, which is around improvement districts. So improvement districts can only apply under volunteer fire departments. They're not eligible to apply under any other funding stream of the Community Emergency Preparedness Fund. So with that last question in under the wire, I'm going to repeat. Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to each and every one of you who took the time to be with us today. Please be in touch if you have questions about potential projects or applications. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.